for our governor, who was John Huntsman, a great individual, a person I have a ton of respect for. So if you will, let's open up the Zoom and get him off of the waiting room. Let's get with us, bring with us U.S. Senator, my good friend, Mike Lee. So let's welcome him here. And Senator, I'm really excited because I get to ask you some questions, and I get to do it in public. So it's really kind of a fun thing for me. We've had lots of great discussions, and you've been such a great senator for Utah, a great example and a great friend. But the first question I have for you is, tell us about the infrastructure bill you're working on now. We want to know why you're not here.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for the invitation, Stuart. I've been looking forward to this for literally months. Hope to be there in person. There's a few things detained me in Washington, and by a few things I mean a few $1 trillion detained me here as we're working on that. The infrastructure bill is part of that. So, day before yesterday, the Senate voted on cloture on the motion to proceed to that legislation. Depending on who you're listening to, that bill may cost $550 billion, or it may cost up to $1.2 trillion. It's one of the concerns that I have right now is that we don't have a score from the Congressional Budget Office. Now, the CBO scoring is, of course, the gold standard of figuring out how much something is going to cost. Typically, we have that score before we move to something, and we don't wait to see it until afterwards. Look, everyone loves infrastructure, sees the need for it. It is a legitimate function of government to make sure that people have access to the things and the people that they need. It is, however, something that frustrates me greatly when there is often an assumption made that if it's infrastructure, it needs to be federal. It happens in so many areas of government. People see a problem and they say, well, if there's a government solution to it, then if the issue is important, then it needs to be the federal government act. That, of course, isn't true. In fact, quite to the contrary, what we see is that very often things are reserved to the states, not because they're not important, but because they are important. And so I'm coming through this bill, which still doesn't exist in its final form. We still don't have final text, to figure out how much of it is legitimate federal spending, something like transportation projects in connection with the interstate highway system, for example, and how much of it consists of things that really could and should be done at the state and the local level. We're also looking at some of the pay points and concern that some put into it, planning to offset the cost, aren't legitimate pay points. For example, they've counted $56 billion in money that they believe will be recouped to the federal government as a result of increased economic activity attributable to that. Sometimes dynamic scoring has its place in tax legislation. It doesn't really have a place in infrastructure spending, and so that's an illegitimate pay for. There are some others that have been concerned that they may never materialize. So I'm not sure where this thing is going. We may be casting more votes on it today and probably tomorrow and through the weekend. But rest assured, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that we understand what's in it, what's not in it, and the ways to make it better.
Well, thank you for that. I think we're looking at our own state, and we're seeing the federal stimulus money come into our state, and we're seeing people spend that money in their personal lives. So we're actually seeing our state budgets, our state revenues increase. And that's one-time money because we aren't going to see federal stimulus next year again. And so we're actually seeing more in revenue coming into our own state. Plus, we're seeing this infrastructure money coming. It seems a little bit strange that that's happening at the same time. You're speaking to a group of people here who hold principles of individual liberty and free enterprise very dear to them. How can state legislators partner with congressional leaders to make sure we preserve those rights for our citizens?
President Adams, it's a fantastic question. I'm so glad you asked it. I think a key to returning to federalism, like the founding fathers intended and like the Constitution requires, and that is returning to a federalism where states have the vast majority of governing power and responsibility, is for state leaders to be supremely jealous of your role, your primary role, and to not be enticed by what may be at the time attractive looking offers from the federal government, by what might appear at the time to be free money when in fact it's not. Look, every time the federal government offers states money, it's part of a deal. Part of a deal designed first and foremost to bring momentary praise and adulation to federal lawmakers. Now, while the money can be easily spent, the power that states accede to the federal government has almost never been returned to its rightful owners, which is you. So one of the most valuable things you can do on your end is to keep us honest, meaning you should be doing exactly what you're doing today and making sure the federal government toes the line. Checks and balances need to be patrolled. Separation of powers need to be guarded. You have just as much of a role in that as anyone else in our republic today. And of course, what we need at the end of the day is for federal lawmakers, all federal elected officials need to start recognizing that there is in fact a difference between state power and federal power. We also need to recognize that we're not always helping when we take money from you, meaning take money from taxpayers in your respective states, move it to Washington, run it through Washington's filter, where some of it sloshes around and gets spilled, and then reallocate it as a few government bureaucrats here in Washington deem appropriate. In the process of doing that, we not only make things less efficient, but when we send that money back to you, it's often less helpful to you because it's federal money. In Utah, for example, I'm told that it's not uncommon for 30, 35%, maybe even more money than that, to be added to the cost of highway projects the minute there's federal money involved. It's because it comes with all these strings, all sorts of regulatory requirements that come with receiving even $1 of federal funding for that project. And so we're making the whole thing less efficient, resulting in fewer Americans benefiting from it. And we can all work together to push and pull power to back where it belongs, which is with you.
So really appreciate that, Senator, and your knowledge of that. You're exactly right. We have rural areas of Utah that get federal money, federal transportation money. We actually replace that money with state money, 75 cents on the dollar, and we have a backlog for people who want that money because of the lack of strings on state money and the regulation we have on federal money as it comes from the federal government. Does not make sense. I've got a couple more questions, but we got a few minutes left. I know you love ALEC, free markets, limited governments, and appreciated your comments on states' rights and federalism. But is there anything you'd like to share with us before we end it? If not, I've got a couple more questions, but I'd like to give you a minute just to share some of your thoughts, Senator Lee.
Oh, thank you. Look, I think it's really important that your focus has been on limited government, free markets, and federalism. And unfortunately, as all of you know too well, these things tend not to be too popular in Washington. And it's fitting that I was asked to speak about these things together, as none of them can exist without the other. They're inextricably intertwined. You can't delink them. The founding fathers knew from history and from their own sad experience the danger associated with the excessive accumulation of power in the hands of the few. As Madison put it in one of my favorite quotes from Federalist 51, he said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to government, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. Now, thankfully, they understood that human beings' feet are planted squarely on the ground. We don't have access to angels. And when in power, and especially when they accumulate excessive power, human beings tend to abuse it, harming economies, undermining the freedom of individuals and society at large. Their great wisdom consisted ultimately in seeing that most often the greatest threats to liberty come from government itself. In other words, they saw that the government needed rules and limitations placed on it. And that's precisely what the founders put in place. Rules to delineate between what belongs to government and what belongs to the people. So they drafted these structural protections in our Constitution. The horizontal protection of separation of powers, dividing the federal government into 3 branches, and the vertical protection of federalism, designating the few and defined powers of the federal government and leaving the rest, all of it, up to states. And, you know, it really is states that govern the best most of the time. That's why we leave them to them. We've got to dispel this absurd notion that if something's important, it's got to go to the federal government. The opposite is true. In other words, what has made America exceptional is not government itself, but government opening up the space for citizens to build creative, productive, meaningful, and happy lives together through their industries, their families, and their communities. Free markets simply can't exist in the absence of limited government. In our system, limited government can't exist in the absence of federalism. The beauty of this interlocking design lies in helping get the federal government out of the way to allow for the flourishing and the freedom of the people. Now, unfortunately, there have been attacks seeking to take us in a direction that's exactly opposite of our exceptional constitutional legacy. Just take, for example, S1, the Democrats' so-called election reform bill, and a prime example of that, of the natural impulse of government to consolidate and centralize power. It's deceptively named the For the People Act, and it's a bill that would overturn effective, organically developed voting laws that exist in all 50 states, and then would replace them with federal mandates written behind closed doors by Democratic activists and politicians. So this is something that we know doesn't belong to the federal government. We know that the Constitution reserves primary authority over voting laws to the states, to you, precisely to protect citizens and communities from abuse and corruption, and to empower the people to hold their leaders accountable. So this bill, S1, would flip that principle on its head, making it easier for politicians to hold perpetual incumbency and draw even more power under the domain of the federal government. Now, unfortunately, the push to centralize federal power is not just one that's happened in recent years, but it's been a steady march for many decades. Ever since its birth, the objective of the American progressive movement has been to elevate into positions of power individuals with the right background, the right social status, temperament, degrees, and ideology, so that they can regulate every aspect of our economy and every aspect of our society. In order to make that objective possible, they're put deliberately into positions in which they're more or less insulated from the political winds of the day. Now, on the surface, this may sound appealing. Progressives lure us into this vision by saying, oh, people who are this important and have this much power can't be subject to the political winds of the day. But in practice, it means these individuals are wholly insulated from the limits and protections provided to us by the Constitution, undermining the entire point of our system and leading to a different kind of tyranny altogether. The tyranny of the bureaucracy, also known as the tyranny of the experts, because they really are given power traditionally reserved for despots. Now, oddly enough, maybe ironically, maybe forebodingly, back in 1930, Franklin D. Roosevelt warned of this very danger while he was still governor of New York, before he even got into the presidential race, condemning what he described as, quote, the doctrine of regulation by masterminds, in whose judgment and will all the people may gladly and quietly acquiesce. Were it possible to find masterminds so unselfish, so willing to decide unhesitatingly against their own personal interests, to private prejudice, men almost godlike in their ability to hold the scales of justice with an even hand, such a government might be to the interest of the country, but there are none such within our political horizon, and we cannot expect a complete reversal of all the teachings of history. He continued, now, to bring about government by oligarchy, masquerading as democracy, is fundamentally essential that practically all authority and control be centralized in our national government, close quote. Now, I sometimes wonder when I read that quote, whether he was longing for that future. But regardless, whether he knew it or not, FDR was echoing precisely Madison's own sentiments in Federalist 51. only describing so-called masterminds instead of angels. FDR understood that, as Madison also put it so well, what is government but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? We ought to take their insights to heart. Indeed, FDR's warning shows us exactly what we're up against today. We have to fight to preserve what has truly made our nation great, which is a tradition of limited government, of free markets, and of federalism, what you're discussing today. We must fight to limit the power of the federal government, to allow the flourishing and the freedom of the people. Look, all of you represent federalism in action. You yourselves are the living embodiment of it. And knowing that you hold the positions that you hold, that you're fighting for these very same principles, gives me hope for our great country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator Lee. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for fighting for federalism and fighting to make sure that we have free markets and limited government.